Just over 100 years ago, on a desolate North Carolina beach, two brothers in their 30s launched 600 pounds of spruce wood, muslin, and aluminum into the air. The brothers successfully launched their odd object 3 more times, watched by only the creatures of the beach, a man from a nearby town, a boy named Johnny Ward, and a few coastal lifeguards. Several years later, the younger brother summed up their first launch as follows. It was, he wrote, the first in the history of the world in which a machine carrying a man had raised itself by its own power into the air in full flight, had sailed forward without reduction in speed, and had finally landed at a point as high as that from which it had started. The two brothers were Wilbur and Orville Wright, and in plain English, what they had done was create the airplane. The Wright brothers were the third and fourth surviving children of Milton Wright and his wife Susan Kerner Wright. Wilbur, born in 1867, attended high school in Richmond, Indiana, and wanted to attend Yale University, but his mother's severe illness prevented him from doing so. In 1869, the Wright family moved to Dayton, Ohio. Orville was born in 1871. He attended Dayton's public schools, where his grades were good but not great. By 1889, Orville and Wilbur were running their own business, Wright and Wright Job Printers. They published a newspaper called the West Side News. They soon renamed it the Evening Item, but the paper lasted only a few months. As the bicycling craze swept the United States, the Wright brothers opened a bicycle shop. The two brothers had inherited their mother's practicality and inventiveness. Besides repairing bicycles, they developed and sold several sturdy bicycle designs of their own. Their shop operated from 1892 until 1916, when Orville closed the business. In 1896, Wilbur and Orville became interested in aviation, inspired by the work of 3 key men. The first man was Otto Lilienthal, who made about 2,500 glider flights during his life. His recent death after a gliding accident increased the brothers' curiosity about the possibility of powered, heavier-than-air flight. The second man was French-born Octave Chanute, who lived in Chicago and was the foremost American engineer of his day. As a bridge builder, Chanute encouraged the Wrights to abandon the idea of bird-shaped wings in favor of a stronger double-wing design. The third man was Samuel P. Langley, third secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, a leading publisher of aviation data. In May of 1899, Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian looking for publications about aviation. He told the Institute, quote, "I wish to obtain such papers as the Smithsonian Institution has published on this subject, and if possible a list of other works in print in the English language." Unquote. He added, quote, "I wish to avail myself of all that is already known and then, if possible, add my mite to help on the future workers who will attain final success." Unquote. Inspired by Chanute's suggestion that the brothers should find a reliably windy place for flight tests, Wilbur also wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau and discovered that the east coast of the Carolinas had regularly strong winds. In 1900, the brothers made their first trip to Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, and experimented with a glider-like kite attached to control cords. The brothers returned there in July 1901 and started testing a new glider. The 1901 glider was larger than the previous version and had a movable front elevator. Based upon incorrect data from Lilienthal about the lifting ability of wing designs, the glider performed worse than expected. In light of this problem, the brothers, now back home, started testing differently shaped airfoils in a wind tunnel of their own design. The brothers completed a new glider in August of 1902 and performed hundreds of successful glides at Kill Devil Hills during September and October. The 1902 glider, equipped with a movable rudder, had more lift and better maneuverability than the brothers' earlier airfoils, convincing Wilbur and Orville that, in the next year, a motorized machine could make it into the air. In February of 1903, along with their mechanic Charlie Taylor, the Wright brothers built and tested a 12-horsepower motor for the flying machine that would make history. In October, at their North Carolina beach camp, the brothers began assembling and testing their first powered machine. On December 14th, Wilbur tried to pilot the machine into the air. Unfortunately, he pulled up too sharply upon takeoff, hit the sand, and damaged the front controls, which then needed repair. 3 days later, on December 17, 1903, Orville made the first successful heavier-than-air controlled flight in history. This flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. Wilbur made a second flight, covering 175 feet, and Orville made a third, covering 200. Wilbur then made a fourth flight, which lasted 59 seconds and ended 852 feet from the takeoff point. While the Wrights were discussing what to do next, a strong wind knocked over their machine, damaging it beyond repair and preventing any more flights that season. That evening, Orville telegraphed his father, reporting the brothers' flight results. The message read, "Success 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind. Started from level with engine power alone. Average speed through the air 31 miles, longest 57 seconds. Inform press, home Christmas, Orville." Aside from a handful of inaccurate news stories that soon followed, the Wright brothers' history-making feat went unnoticed. In 1904, the two brothers established a flying base at Huffman Prairie, an open pasture 8 miles east of Dayton, Ohio, reached by local roads and a commuter rail line. In April and May, the brothers started testing a new airplane capable of new feats. On September 15th, Wilbur flew the first half-circle ever made in an airplane. 5 days later, Orville flew the first complete controlled circle, which Wilbur diagrammed for his own records and for posterity. In 1905, also at Huffman Prairie, the two brothers developed the first practical airplane, one that could fly longer distances and perform complex maneuvers. In light of this success, in 1906, the Wrights started seeking buyers for the airplane. In 1907, the U.S. Army Signal Corps advertised bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Knowing that they had no real competition, the brothers confidently submitted a bid. In February of 1908, the Army accepted their bid for a machine costing $25,000. In May, Wilbur piloted a plane with Dayton resident Charles Furness on board, making Furness the first airplane passenger in history. In August, in Le Mans, France, Wilbur made the brothers' first flight in Europe. This flight eliminated all doubt that he and his brother had invented an airplane and quickly made them internationally famous. On September 17th, Orville was performing airplane trials for the Signal Corps at Fort Myer, Virginia. That day he was badly injured when a propeller splintered in flight and sent his machine crashing to earth. On board with him had been Army Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, who also suffered severe injuries. Selfridge died soon after the crash, making him the first person to die in an airplane accident. In light of Selfridge's death and Orville's life-threatening injuries, the Wrights suspended their flights until they could build safer propellers. In January of 1909, having recovered from his injuries, Orville, along with his sister Catherine, sailed to Europe to join Wilbur, who was already on the continent trying to drum up buyers for their planes. In May, the siblings steamed back to New York Harbor and then made their way home to Ohio. On July 17th and 18th of 1909, the city of Dayton held a homecoming celebration for the Wright brothers, treating them like heroes. The city staged a parade with military units, marching bands, floats, and the presentation of state and national medals to the two brothers. On July 19th, the brothers escaped the uproar of Dayton to resume the Army trials suspended after Orville's crash, and successfully completed them on July 30th. In August, the U.S. Army purchased from the Wrights the first military airplane in history. In November, Wilbur and Orville incorporated the Wright Company to manufacture airplanes. In April 1912, while on a business trip to Boston, Wilbur contracted typhoid fever and fell seriously ill. Catherine telegraphed Orville in Washington, D.C., telling him to ignore reports that his older brother's condition was serious. Nevertheless, on May 30th, after a month-long fight with his illness, Wilbur died at age 45. Reporting on Wilbur's burial, a local newspaper praised him as, quote, a spiritually minded man, remarkably free from covetousness, vanity, and pride, unquote. In 1915, Orville sold the Wright Company to a syndicate of investors, which gave him more time to work on pet projects. The company later merged and became the Wright-Martin Company. In 1919, when aviator pioneer Glenn Martin left the firm, Wright-Martin reorganized as the Wright Aeronautical Company. Meanwhile, back in 1916, Orville had moved into a new laboratory on North Broadway in Dayton. Orville's active role in aviation declined during the 1920s. But as America's elder statesman in the field, he continued to serve on various aeronautical boards and committees. For example, from 1920 to 1948, he served on the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And from 1926 to 1930, he worked with the Guggenheim Fund for the promotion of aeronautics. In 1929, Wright Aeronautical and the Curtiss Airplane Company merged to form Curtiss-Wright, one of America's largest aircraft and engine companies. This company continues to this day as a major supplier of aviation parts and similar products. In November 1932, the federal government dedicated the Wright Memorial Tower at Kill Devil Hill, North Carolina, commemorating Wilbur and Orville's first 4 flights. In 1944, Orville took his last airplane flight, more than 4 decades after his first one. On April 26th, he briefly handled the controls of a 4-engine Lockheed Constellation. Late in 1947, Orville suffered a mild heart attack while doing the routine chore of repairing a doorbell. After a second attack, he died on January 30th, 1948, the last of the Wright siblings to die. His funeral took place on February 7th. Like Wilbur, he was buried in the family plot in Woodland Cemetery in Dayton. Together or alone, the Wright brothers developed roughly 19 versions of gliders and airplanes, ran several companies, inspired and trained countless aviators, and helped place the United States at the forefront of aviation science and technology, a position it still holds today. The original Wright Flyer, the one that Orville piloted into the air in 1903, exists to this day. After the plane was damaged in 1903, the Wright brothers took it back to Dayton and stored it in a shed behind their bicycle shop on West 3rd Street. In June 1916, after repairing the machine, Orville displayed it at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. 7 months later, he displayed it at New York City's Grand Central Palace. Still later, because of a dispute with the Smithsonian Institute, Orville shipped the flyer to the Science Museum of London. By 1943, Orville and the Smithsonian had reconciled, and in 1948 the Institute held an installation ceremony to honor the Wright brothers and their historic machine. The original Wright Flyer now hangs in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum on the National Mall. 600 pounds of spruce wood, muslin, and aluminum that changed the world.